All right. Well, hello. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Brian Hedden. I work with the Brooklyn Greenway Initiative on advocacy and Greenway projects. And tonight we're going to be hearing from a couple of people at the Naval Cemetery Landscape. First, we're going to hear from Ava Rossi, the Director of Horticulture and Greenway Stewardship. She's going to walk us through an introduction to the NCL and its programs. And then after that, we're going to hear from Eric Thompson, who's a gardener at the NCL, and he's going to take us through the birds that have been coming through the NCL over the past year. After each person has a chance to speak, after Ava speaks, we're going to stop for a little bit, and we're going to take 2 or 3 questions that come in through the Q&A. And then after that, we'll move ahead with Eric's presentation, and we'll take other questions at the end. And I think you can enter any of those questions into the Q&A. And with that, I'll hand it off to Ava Rossi.
All right, so I'm just going to give a brief introduction to what the NCL is. For those of you, you might have been here, you might not have. We are a small landscape along the Brooklyn waterfront Greenway, and we are built and maintained by the nonprofit Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, which is about a 20-year-old nonprofit that advocates for basically safe and greenways to be built. So when I say greenway, I mean a bike and pedestrian path that is separate from automobile traffic. So the Brooklyn waterfront Greenway, you can go to the next slide here. You can see it here. It stretches all the way from Greenpoints and snakes around the coast to the East New York neighborhood. And then you can kind of see some examples of what a greenway can look like in the side there. It can either be, hopefully incorporating some green, that can be a street tree, that can be perennial plantings along the greenway. But we want that to be included as we advocate for these to be built across the city. Next slide. Right, so these are sort of the 4 things that Brooklyn Greenway Initiative does right now. So I mentioned the advocacy and public engagement around greenways being built, including the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the Naval Cemetery soon. The Greenway user study we mentioned here, that is a study that's just now wrapping up, where we've installed monitors that gather data along the greenway at 31 different sensors that sense body shape and speed to determine how the greenway is being used by bikes, by pedestrians, by motorcycles, by electric bikes. And we're gathering data to interpret and to build safer, better greenways. The NYC Greenways Coalition is taking the work that we do for the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and applying what we've been able to do here to other greenways being built throughout the city. So it's a coalition that includes other nonprofits across all 5 boroughs as they are implementing greenway infrastructure into city planning. Next. You can kind of see our mission here, and I've put our website. We have 2 different Instagrams, one specifically for the Naval Cemetery Landscape, and then just a sort of sample of what a street might look like with or without a greenway here. Next slide. And so as we talk about the Naval Cemetery Landscape today, I just wanted to give everybody a sense of where this is. We're in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, although we have a separate entrance off of Williamsburg Street West. And this is along the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway. So really easy to bike and walk to this location. And you can see it here. Next slide. So this is a little less than 2 acres or 1.7 acres, intentionally planted meadow with a wooded perimeter. We have, over 50 different herbaceous perennial plants in the meadow alone, and then different mixes along the perimeter for shade and wet shade. And then, of course, our trees, some of which are natives and planted, and some are original to the site before this was installed in 2015. So this is a relatively young urban meadow. Installation ended in 2017, which is when we opened. And you can see one of the main reasons we built the site is to talk about the impact that a well-designed and well-maintained green space can have for the city. So the idea is by measuring the biodiversity on site and human wellness effects in the neighborhood by having this site, we can add to evidence that our greenways need to also include these so they can become corridors for wildlife throughout the city, and also sites themselves for human observation and human benefit of green space. Next slide. This is just the Greenway. This is the Naval Cemetery Landscape with a boardwalk. And we have a raised boardwalk, so you're not actually on the ground here. But you are able to observe very close up. Next slide. We are open in the winter. Our winter hours will be dropping to weekends only. Hopefully with the support of more people for a Brooklyn Greenway initiative, we can expand those hours. The need for green space does not disappear in the winter. And as Eric will point out in his presentation, winter resources are really important for biodiversity of life. So next slide. Another shot of winter. Next slide. You can see this is another sort of way to access the meadow. We have these mooring blocks where you can feel more submerged in the plants. This is an earlier spring shot on the left here. You can actually feel a little bit more submerged with our taller plants at this point of the season. Next slide. Just showing the amount of invasive weeds we might pull out in a typical day. This is a volunteer event, but usually it is our core gardening staff, including Eric, that's doing this work. Next slide. And then you can just cycle through the next few slides, Brian. I just included a few shots of some of the programming and different installations we've done here. So we have an art residency program, we have ecology walks, and we have music sometimes as part of that artist residency program. So we do programming for the community, and we provide everything free. This is a training session on spring weed removal. Next slide. And next slide. Yeah, and then we also do Greenway stewardship along the Greenway. So, we talked about that 30-mile corridor of Greenway. This is us working very close to the NCL, actually, but we also do occasionally have stewardship events. And next. This is just a little, I'm actually think Eric's going to cover a lot of this, so I'll be very quick. Some of the tools that you might be interested in, if you're interested in this, are Merlin, which is a bird song identification app, iNaturalist, which is a photo identifying app that also helps the research community each time you submit a photo. Obviously, some guidebooks, which we'll talk a little bit about. The NCL is a great place to see these birds because of our management strategies. So we're leaving up our plants over the winter. We're leaving up the seed heads. We're also choosing plants that support a wide variety of insects. The observations that he's going to show you, he'll talk about the time frame. But I will let you know that if you want to come see these things for yourself, we're open right now 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Wednesday through Sunday until November, when our hours will go down to weekends only, as I said. I have put here, join Eric Sunday mornings if you would like to observe with him. He's actually going to be leaving at the end of this month, but you still have a few weekends to do that. And if not, there will always be another gardener on site, and we're always happy to talk about the biodiversity on site. And that's it. I think, actually, next slide, sorry. This is a very, very brief review of taxonomy. We're not really actually going to go into super detail on taxonomy on this slide, so I'm not really going to go over all of this. But basically, life is divided. The life on Earth has been divided by scientists. The more specific you go down, which is going from left to right here, the more specific you go down in all the way down to species, is more shared characteristics among your insects. So as you're doing ID, you might want to review your taxonomy, and then if you can get down to identifying families for birds and plants, you usually are able to key something out. So if you have questions about that, let us know, but we won't go into detail actually on this presentation with that. So, all right, and that's me. I think I've kind of gone over, so I'd actually like to save some questions until the end, and just hand it off to Eric at this point. So.
I'm Eric Thompson. I started here while I was getting my master's in animal behavior and conservation. I have been following the insects and the birds and everything else that lives in this space since 2023. I followed them across two main seasons with both spring and fall migration. And I've been photographing and cataloging everything I possibly can. I've taken a lot of photos. So this list is not going to be comprehensive because it's just impossible to show the actual amount of biodiversity, but I'm going to give a brief snapshot, a glimpse into it. So I just want to say that here at the Naval Cemetery Landscape, this is a place that humans have designated as a place of death, but life still thrives here. And in a city where real estate is a valuable resource, the tide of progress is stemmed by the dead themselves. This, in turn, has created a refuge where life is allowed to be as it was before the city, well, at least as close as it can be. This is a place where wildflowers still grow in the middle of a concrete jungle. The lives of these flowers support an ever-evolving cast of characters that ebb and flow with the changing seasons. The flowers live and the flowers die, enabling new flowers to take their places. Each flower blooms in its own place and time. The insects that come to feed on the flowers and live their own cycles, they come from their own places and times. And the birds come from their own places and in their own times. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth is essential to this earth. It is a dance on repeat. Next slide, please. So all of the photos in this presentation were taken here. None of these photos were taken anywhere else, and none of them have been downloaded from any sources online. All the photos were taken by myself, and they were all taken with a cell phone or a Sony Alpha 6000 camera. It's nothing special. This is a very easy thing to do in your own backyard with your own equipment. None of this is really that special. And I just want to reiterate that this is not a comprehensive list. There are so many insects and plants here that it's just not possible to show them all in an hour. Some of these images may be a little unpleasant to view because they show some spiders and some wasps that some people may find unpleasant to actually look at. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to take us through the life and death of a flower, a few profiles of a couple of flowers, some bird profiles, a quick look at mimics, and then a little bit on things that happen in specific places and in specific times. And then I'm going to go through the seasons just through a picture essay. Next slide, please. All right, so this is how a flower begins. It begins as a seed, and then it becomes a seedling in the spring. And different seeds have different ways of being dispersed and different ways of being stratified. Some of them need a cold spell. Some of them need to be digested by a bird or a mammal or something first. Some of them have to be scratched up. Some of them, they have to be carried a long distance by wind or by an animal, or sometimes just by sticking to an animal. Next slide, please. So this is a milkweed. This is before it's bloomed. It still supports life even before it blooms. Next slide. And then this is, of course, after it's bloomed, where it supports a lot of pollinators. But this bloom only lasts for a very brief amount of time, and then it's gone. But this plant supports supports life all throughout its entire existence. So the bloom is only a very small part of what it does. Next slide. Here, the milkweed is again as seeds, and these are wind dispersed. So sometimes wind will come through and push them off, or a large animal will come through and shake the plant, which will also shake them off into the air, and then the wind will carry them very long distances. On windier days here, it almost looks like a reverse snowstorm where these things are floating up into the sky. Next slide. And then finally, all of these plants, their spring growth, after it becomes a flower and after it disperses its seed, it falls and it goes back to the earth and it dies. Then it is decomposed by these little mushrooms and other small insects and mollusks and things like that that break it back down and put it back in the soil to feed the next generation. This is an essential thing, and is part of the reason that we never let organic material leave the space, because it all has to go back to feed the next generation of life. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram of the ways that a lot of different creatures and plants and things interact. So a lot of times it's described as a food chain, but in reality, it's much more interwoven than a simple chain. So at the top here, we often think of raptors and birds of prey, and they in turn feed on the little birds and the little mammals that inhabit the space. And then those in turn feed on the pollinators, and they feed on the grazers, and they feed on sometimes even, the snails and the slugs and the earthworms. The dragonflies and spiders, they occupy a position between the pollinators and the small birds and mammals, because they feed on other insects, which helps keep everything in balance. The pollinators, they have their roles, and then the grazers, which a lot of times we think of them as pests. They're the grasshoppers and the katydids and Japanese beetles, things like that, that tend to eat the things that the flowers that we work very hard to keep alive. But all of these other systems keep them in check. And then, of course, when anything dies, it is broken down by the decomposers down here at the bottom. Next slide, please. So here are some of our birds of prey that visit quite often, actually. There's a group of red-tailed hawks that lives nearby. They actually live in one of the inaccessible parts of the Navy Yard. There's a nest back there that has been relatively persistent for a few years now. We see them circling overhead quite a bit, but also here, because this space itself has evolved multiple times, there are these old telephone poles in the ground from when it used to be a ballpark. The raptors especially really enjoy these poles, so we left them alone. And the red tails and the kestrels both will perch up there and use it to look for things to eat. So on the left here we have red tails, and on the right we have kestrel. And in the lower picture of the kestrel, it's actually eating a grasshopper that it caught in the meadow. Not only the raptor species, but many species of the birds like these dead trees, called snags. And we have a few of them around the area that we've also chosen to leave there, because many of the birds find it to be a good perching spot for visibility and for safety. Next slide, please. So here are some of the small mammals that we have at the space. We have mice, not pictured here. We also have bats that you're not likely to see unless you're here late at night for an event. But we have a group of 3 raccoons that frequently visits the space, and we also have this little cottontail rabbit that is actually it's not quite endangered, but it's considered threatened, and they're very rare in this area. But it finds food and shelter here. Even when you can't see it in the very thick summer vegetation, it's still around. We find traces of it in little poops and things like that. And then there are mice that live in some of the wood piles in the back. And they have a role in dispersing seeds and keeping certain pest insects under control. Next slide, please. We have very many small birds here. Here are a few examples. We have sparrows and finches and warblers. We have flycatchers, of course, blue jays and crows and cardinals, things we see quite often. They adapt very well to human habitation. But we also have thrushes and woodpeckers, and then over the open meadow, the swallows, the barn swallows, and the chimney swifts can be seen swooping around as they try to catch insects in flight. So here, pictured in the top left is a white-throated sparrow. In the top right is an eastern kingbird that's perched on a American pokeweed. We have a downy woodpecker on the bottom left, and we have a cedar waxwing on the bottom right. Next slide, please. So here are some of our mid-level predators. These are so we have a blue darner dragonfly. We have a Chinese mantis. We have a crab spider that is hanging out on some of the blue vervain, which is another native species here. We have a drone fly, which will eat aphids. We have robber flies, which will eat a number of flying insects, such as other like house flies and mosquitoes and things like that. And then, of course, everyone's favorite garden friend, the seven-spot ladybug, as it's choosing some aphids to eat. But all of these insects support the upper level predators, including the American kestrels, which will often be seen taking praying mantises, grasshoppers, and sometimes dragonflies out of the meadow in the later summer and fall when these insects are much larger. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have our pollinators. Pollinators come in many shapes and sizes. Here we have some bees and some wasps. We also have beetles that can be pollinators, such as the firefly and this little cucumber beetle. There are many fly species that pollinate as well. Here we have a bottlefly. We have some moths. This is an Ailanthus webworm moth on some Joe Pye weed. And then also birds can be pollinators. This is an orchard oriole, which is a fairly rare visitor to the site, but like hummingbirds, they're considered pollinators. Next slide, please. So these grazers is not a technical term, but I've labeled them that because they serve a somewhat similar function to what the larger mammals that graze in open plains and in forests do. They do keep some of the plants in check, but the larger predators like the kestrels and the insectivore warblers help keep these from becoming too numerous and eating the whole place out. So these insects are, while often considered pests, they're incredibly important for the entire food web. Next slide, please. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, the decomposers. We have many different species of fungus here. We have a leopard slug here in the middle, and slugs and snails are a big part of decomposing. And we also have, of course, earthworms. And then here a spotted lanternfly that is dead is being dismantled by ants. All of these things make the nutrients available in the dead matter. They take those nutrients and they put them back into the soil to make them available for the next generation of plants. So they're very essential. Even the calcium and things in the snail shells, it gets broken down and put back into the ground. which is an essential nutrient for very many things. Next slide, please. So here we have some flower profiles. In the center is a woodland sunflower, and around it are some examples of some of the things that live on them. Now, of course, as I said before, this is not a comprehensive list. There are so many more species that then can be represented here, but I've chosen a few from each group. Here we have a dragonfly. This is a blue dasher male dragonfly. Then we have, of course, a bumblebee. We have a leaf hopper, a ladybug. So leaf hoppers, beetles, snails, true bugs, flies, jumping spiders. This is a clouded sulfur, I believe, butterfly. We have many different species of butterflies use these flowers. And then, of course, the American goldfinch, which is incredibly dependent on flowers like this for seeds. Next slide, please. So this is a similar setup. We have the common milkweed in the middle, and then, of course, the monarch butterfly and one of its caterpillars. We have a painted lady butterfly, a praying mantis, a large milkweed bug, a lynx spider, a ladybug larva, a large milkweed beetle, or I'm sorry, a red milkweed beetle, a green conehead leafhopper, I believe. And we have, I don't remember what kind of wasp this is. So I'm not, insects are very difficult to ID. So I'm not going to be very specific about most of these because there are so many more species than we can actually imagine of everything listed here. There are so many spiders, so many butterflies, so many wasps and bees. It's kind of amazing when you really get looking at it. And then, of course, a slug, and then so flowers, as I said before, don't just serve a role as for pollinators. They also, when they're no longer flowering, they still serve a purpose. And here we have this is a fly-catching bird that is perched on a milkweed, a dried up milkweed out in the meadow as it searches for insects. Next slide, please. And then this is the purple coneflower with a couple of its supported cast. Of course, we have a black swallowtail butterfly. We have a couple of different kinds of bumblebees. I'm not going to try to name them. We have this is either a goldenrod soldier beetle or a Pennsylvania leatherwing. We have a very unusual species of fly here that I cannot identify. And then we also have a dark-eyed junco. And this bird arrives in the winter long after all of these flowers are gone, and it will harvest the seeds that are left. So you'll often see it at the NCL in the winter time when there's not much else going on here, but it'll be running along the boardwalk and peering over the edge looking for little seeds. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just a quick thing about mimics. So in nature, bright colors, like you see in the monarch butterfly, are usually warning signs that a thing is dangerous or toxic. So these two on the left here, this is the large milkweed bug on the far left, and in the middle of the left, there is a small milkweed bug. One of the things that helps you understand what you're looking at is the fact that they are both on milkweed plants, which gives them their toxicity. This other one here on the right is not toxic at all. It's a mimic that is meant to fool predators into thinking that it is toxic. And you'll notice it's not on a milkweed, it's actually on a mugwort plant. But that is one of several defenses that insects use to fool predators into thinking that this is not something I want to eat. And then over here on the right, on the top, we have a bee, it's a honeybee. And on the bottom, we have a fly that looks like a bee. And one of the things that gives it away is the eyes. So the eyes on the fly are huge, and they take up most of their head. On the bee, they're much smaller, and they're only on the very sides. So that's one of the ways to tell this is actually a hoverfly. And it is both a predator and a pollinator. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about some birds. So one of the things about birds is that their beak shapes, their evolution has shaped their beaks to fit the thing that they're eating. There has been recent evidence to suggest that the things that they eat aren't the only things that affect their beak shape. The temperatures in which they live apparently also have a role. But for these purposes, the thing that we really need to notice is that these insect catching birds have small, sort of like knife shaped beaks that makes it easier for them to pick insects out of plants that are usually not wanting to be picked out of the plant. And then of course we have grain eating birds, which are, more of your finches and cardinals and things like that, and they eat a lot of seeds. And then generalist birds like the ravens and the blue jays and the grackles, their beaks are more rounded on top and flatter underneath. And then the woodpeckers, because they're digging holes in trees, typically, their beaks are shaped more like a chisel or a drill. And then, of course, raptor birds usually have a pretty sharp hook on the front for tearing. Now, one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that these generalist birds and the chiseling and the raptorial birds, this is the entire list of these birds that come to this space. The grain-eating birds have a longer list, and the insect-catching birds have the longest list. Because of the meadow and the flowers and everything else that goes on here, this place supports a huge cast of insect-catching birds. And when you're trying to identify what kind of a bird you're looking at, the beak shape is a really good way to get you started, because it tells you automatically what kind of things it eats. And well, as you can see, a lot of warblers are insect eaters. Insect catchers like the eastern phoebe and the fly catching birds like the kingbird and the least flycatcher, they're all insect eating birds, and they have similar beak shapes. So it's one way to narrow down what kind of a bird are we looking at. Next slide, please. Before I get too much further, I wanted to talk about this because this is very important to understanding this space. So we've had confirmed 83 species of birds have visited the NCL. Most of the birds that come here eat insects almost exclusively, but even birds that don't eat insects as adults still feed their young with insects. 96% of all terrestrial birds in North America, and when they say terrestrial birds, they don't mean seabirds like gulls and terns and herons. What they're talking about is pretty much everything else. So 96% of terrestrial birds feed their young almost exclusively with insects, even if they typically eat seeds or fruit as adults. These birds cannot be supported with bird feeders alone. It's just not enough. And many of these species will never visit a bird feeder under any circumstances. Small insect-eating birds like kinglets, we get these usually during migration. They're very tiny little birds. And they have a metabolism that's quite similar to a hummingbird. And if you know anything about hummingbirds, they live on razor thin margins. They have to have a lot of calories because their metabolism is so fast to support their tiny little bodies. and the how quickly they beat their wings, that they have to have a constant supply of food. So the kinglets lived in a very similar way. A kinglet can starve to death in an hour. So for them to be traveling over a dead zone where there are very few insects, it's very, very risky. So places like this are a very much needed rest area for them to stop and get some food as they continue on their flight, especially considering how much of the city is concrete and how much of it is surrounded by subdivisions. Subdivisions like in New Jersey and in Long Island, the lawns create dead zones where there are no insects. So most of these birds, they can't find anything to eat there at all. So they have to have little places like this little refuge, this little oasis here. It's like it literally is an oasis in the desert. A single pair of Carolina chickadees, which is another very small bird, can feed their nestlings 6,000 or more caterpillars before the babies reach independence, before they are fully fledged and fully feeding themselves. 6,000 caterpillars. That's a lot of caterpillars. Global insect decline is contributing to huge losses in songbird populations. Bird decline worldwide is not equal. Terrestrial insect-eating birds are, especially, and pretty much any bird that relies on insects for at least one stage of life, even if it's just as babies, have declined so much more than other birds. According to this paper that's linked at the bottom, it is 3 billion individuals from numbers recorded just a few decades ago. Pesticides, of course, play a huge role in this, but also suburban lawns that don't support insects. Native plants support many more local insects than invasives do. Just here at the NCL, you can observe the places where the mugwort has many fewer insects than the areas where the native flowers are. So we work very hard to try to keep the invasive species of plants out of here so that the other plants can have a chance. There are, as I was trying to show in the flower profiles, those are native species of flowers, and they support so many insects, so many more insects than I can put in this presentation. But I spend a lot of time weeding mugwort, and I find very few insects there. And most of them are just hopping through to get to somewhere else. Bird feeders are not going to fix this problem. Places like this, native flowers, that's the only thing that's really going to help here. And not using pesticides. If you want to read more about it, this paper is open access. So there's no paywall. Next slide, please. So this is this is the list that I have amassed of confirmed species that I have seen with my eyes and confirmed that they were here. Many of these I do have photos of, but of course I couldn't put them all here. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on this particular list, but I have included the order and the family, and then of course the common names of the species. So in all the dark gray, we see different families. So that's a lot of different kinds of birds that are all visiting this one space. Many of these, like the chimney swifts, the kestrels, the woodpeckers, the flycatchers, the vireos, the swallows, the kinglets, the warblers, they all eat so many insects. And the only reason that they are here is because of this meadow. Next slide, please. All right, so one thing that I also want to talk about here is places and times. So the natural world, and the creatures that live in it, they are very beholden to timing. Timing is everything. When to leave for migration, when to raise your young, when to lay eggs, when to do all of these things matters so much. And these particular ones I've selected just to highlight their migrations is, as many of us know, monarchs fly great distances to get to Mexico on wings that are thinner than paper. They have to choose their moments very carefully, and they have multiple generations per year, and only the final generation that year makes that trip. So they have to be exact. Having lots of milkweed here gives them a chance to rest up, a chance to lay eggs, even deep into the summer. The black and white warbler here in the middle, it migrates to northern South America. It's a very long distance. But when it leaves, the junco arrives. So they migrate down and spend the winter here in New York from the Arctic. So there are many birds that, as one is leaving, another one is arriving to take advantage of something that the other bird couldn't. This is an insect-eating bird, this black and white warbler. So when insects decline in the winter, as is typical, they can't stay here anymore, so they have to go where the insects are. But as they leave, the juncos are arriving because we still have seeds that aren't covered in snow yet. So there are, everything has its place and it has its own time to do its thing. And not everything migrates to, where we typically think that they go. So these little juncos spend so much time in a very barren place. So they come here, and this is a place where they can find food. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting thing. I've spent a little bit of time here at night and discovered some very interesting things that I don't see during the day. One of these is the evening primrose at the top here. During the day, its flowers stay closed. But when it's night, this is the same flower here in the dark. It opens. And the reason that a flower would open its bloom at night would be that it's pollinated by something that only shows up at night. And in this case, it's moths, and specifically hawk moths, which I have in this little video here. Brian, do you mind clicking on the play button for the little video yeah. This is a hummingbird hawk moth, which is usually a late evening or late night visitor to the NCL. Here it's, of course, visiting our milkweeds. But this is maybe not this specific species, but other species of moths just like this one pollinate this flower at night. So unfortunately, none of us are likely to see it, but that is just one of those things that nature is all about timing. So it has adapted to its pollinator. And then down here, we have on the lower left, we have what I've been calling a ghost spider because it reminds me of little ghost crabs that you find on the beach at night. But I don't see this during the day, ever. But when I was here at night, they were everywhere. It was kind of surprising to see how many there were. And then praying mantises, their eyes appear black in the dark. There's still some debate about exactly why that is. But it likely helps them to see better. What I found when I was here was that the praying mantises were incredibly active in the dark. Much more so than they are during the day, where they seem to stay more hidden. And then this is here on the little canvas is a click beetle, which I also rarely see during the day, but I found almost a dozen of them in one night. So it's another one of those things that it's there and it's being supported by all of this, but we just don't see it. Next slide, please. So here, this is just a slide about how rain and wind and cloud cover can affect things. So fungus tends to fruit right after it rains, particularly a heavy rain for these larger white ones. But these smaller, I think we call them witches jellies, they will be nowhere to be seen, and about 10 minutes after it rains, they'll be everywhere. So they really choose their moments. And then so we have milkweed here with some pooled water. And because of the shape of these leaves, water can stay pooled up in them for up to an hour after it rains. And this allows insects that can't necessarily just go find water easily to gather a little bit, especially the wasps. And then so here in the bumblebee in the pink flower, this is a Joe Pye weed, and the bumblebee is using this Joe Pye weed as shelter from the rain. So this is another way that a flower can support an insect that isn't necessarily just pollen or leaves. And then, of course, the dragonflies, they tend to land when it's very windy and cloudy, because the insects, the smaller insects that they feed on, go deeper into the meadow, and it's exhausting to fly against the wind. So it's one of the best times for me to get photos of dragonflies is when it's cloudy and windy, because that's when they land. And then snails and slugs, because they're mollusks and they're soft-bodied creatures, they do most of their movements when it rains to save water. And then because when an insect molts, it's incredibly vulnerable, especially to things like dehydration and water loss. So what we found is this is a large milkweed bug that's molting, and you can see a couple of other shells. They tend to do it right after it rains while the humidity is high and things are very wet, and they have a chance to molt without dying. Their chances of survival are much higher if they choose the right moment. And then, of course, here we have a barn swallow as it flies over the meadow. They also pretty much only fly over the meadow when it's rather calm and very sunny. Next slide, please. And then here's another. These are just interesting moments in time. So on the bottom left here, we have, this is a longhorn beetle. It's a locust borer that we do not see here at the NCL until the goldenrod blooms. And then once the goldenrod has stopped blooming, it is gone and we don't see it again. It's actually here right now. I saw one an hour ago. But haven't seen them all year until the goldenrod were here. The goldfinch waits. So most birds, especially songbirds, most songbirds, they do their spring molt and they do their mating and breeding in the early spring. The goldfinch does not. It waits until July, and does most of its breeding in late July and August, because it's waiting for these sunflowers and other flowers. But it's a seed-eating bird that needs a lot of seeds available. So when it first comes out in the spring, a lot of the flowers, they haven't had a chance to create seeds yet. So they wait until exactly the right moment. And while most other birds have already raised their young and are heading south, the goldfinches are here today feeding their fledglings from the sunflowers. So that's pretty amazing. And then, so this is cranberry viburnum over here. And these berries are available pretty early in the year, but all the birds ignore them until roughly November. when I did some research into whether humans could eat them, it turns out that they don't taste very good until after the first frost. So it is possible that that is what the birds are waiting for. Because in November, the hermit thrushes will come through and just clean them out. So that provides a good early winter source of food when other foods are scarce. Next slide, please. And then there's one final thing about places and times. When looking for birds, it's important to know where they are. So many birds, like the Baltimore Oriole, they tend to hang out in the canopy. So they're very high up in the tree. If you want to see them, you're most likely to see them. Of course, it's nothing is ever 100%, but you're most likely to see these kinds of birds up in the very tops of the trees. Other birds, like the black and white warbler dangling from the tree trunk here, you're more likely to see them crawling up and down the trunks of the trees, like a brown creeper or sometimes water thrushes. Then other birds, you're more likely to see them running around on the ground, like the white-throated sparrows, sometimes the robins. Mourning doves tend to be on the ground, rummaging around in the leaf litter. Redstarts are usually pretty easy to see on the ground, but they can also be up in the tops of the trees. But knowing where they are and where you see them and what they're doing can tell you a lot about what kind of a bird it is. And here we have a Canada warbler in the woodland sunflowers. Very, very difficult to see bird, but if you sit and watch for a moment, you'll see them peek out every once in a while. And then this is a northern mockingbird on the American pokeweed again. Many of the birds here really like the American pokeweed. Actually, right about now, so I witnessed many different species of birds eating them, from mockingbirds to robins to cedar waxwings and the thrushes, and yeah, so very many birds will eat the catbirds, and then other birds like the insect-eating birds will sometimes use it as cover so they can sit out in the meadow and hunt insects. So the yeah, where a bird is tells you a lot about what it eats, and then what it eats can tell you where to find it. So these are all things that can help you identify birds if you're looking for them, or just know where to look for them. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now we're just going to quickly go through some photos. This is more of a photo essay. I have gone season by season and month by month, and there's a slide each for flowers, insects, and birds, all photos taken during that month. And one thing I want to talk about here is that in this photo, you can see the boardwalk very well. If you come out to the garden right now, because the Joe Pye weeds and the woodland sunflowers and the asters are so tall, you can barely see the edges of the boardwalk. But early in spring, all of these things are just coming out. So this is a good time to see things like the rabbit or little ground birds. Next slide, please. So here we have a couple of things that bloom early. We have cranberry viburnum, and we have eastern redbud, and mulberries, and service berries. These are all things that provide good resources for early pollinators when not much else is blooming. So it's very helpful for bees and butterflies early in the year. Next slide. Even as much as many people don't really care for dandelions, dandelions are a very valuable source of food for birds and also pollen for pollinators early in the year when there isn't much else going on. We also have Zizia, or also known as Golden Alexander, and columbine growing. early in the year. It's a good time to see these particular flowers before the rest of the meadow catches up. But also beetle grubs are still, they're just coming up out of the ground. Um, Little grasshoppers are still very small, and wasps are just building their nests for the year. Next slide, please. And then here's just a few of the birds. There's a northern flicker on the ground here. I was surprised to see how often they actually land in the meadow. And then robin on an eastern redbud, and we have a white-throated sparrow here on the ground. These are all really easy birds to see early in the year, and then a mourning dove that got started with a brood very early. They do quite well most of the year. Mourning doves can actually have up to 6 broods a year, so they're quite prolific breeders. And then, of course, our rabbit, one of the best times to see the rabbit is when there's not a lot of foliage. Next slide, please. So here we are in May. The cranberry viburnum is still going a little bit. The golden Alexander are still going a little bit, but we also have some new additions. We have some spiderwort. We have black cherry with a red admiral butterfly on it. And then black locust down here in the bottom middle. We have service berries. They're not quite right, but they're getting there. The mockingbirds, the waxwings, the catbirds really love the service berries. They're also known as a Juneberry because they'll be ripe in June. And then we have foxglove beard tongue to the right. Next slide, please. Here we have an interesting cast of characters. We have a least skipper butterfly, some kind of, well, it could either be a soldier beetle or a lizard beetle, but we have ladybug larva, we have a moth, we have that's a painted lady butterfly. One of the things that I've learned when trying to identify all of these insects is how little we actually know about a lot of these insects. There are a lot of caterpillars that we still don't actually know what they turn into. That's not like a me thing. That is a science thing. We're still having trouble figuring out, what all these little relationships are because there's just so much going on out here. We have a jumping spider in the middle. We have a little sharpshooter plant hopper. And then, as you can see, this little praying mantis down at the bottom is very, very tiny. They'll get much, much bigger over the year, but just a little guy now. Next slide. Here are some of our birds in May. We have a robin on a little nest that's back in the woods feeding its young. We have a common yellowthroat. In the middle, we have a blue jay that is dive bombing a red-tailed hawk that it's not very happy with. As the red-tailed hawk tries to eat something on top of one of the poles, we have a scarlet tanager and a yellow warbler that has caught a little housefly. Next slide, please. I should have mentioned that in May is usually a spring migration for New York City. So it's a good time to see birds that you typically won't see the rest of the year. One of the best times to come by the NCL is actually during the 5-borough bike tour when the BQE is very quiet. It makes it easy to hear the birds. And it also coincides with migration. So here in June, we have, this is what's left in the top left of the columbine. It's starting to dry out and go to seed now. The milkweed is just getting kicked off. And then we have some coneflowers. We have the butterfly weed, the orange ones. And then we have mountain mint and dogbane with a honeybee on it, coreopsis and Joe pieweed that hasn't quite gotten started yet. They're a bit of a later bloomer. Next slide. And then this is a dogbane leaf beetle, this little shiny metallic looking beetle. They're quite beautiful. We have a this is a crab spider on a flower known as a mountain pink. This is a very, very tiny flower and an even tinier spider. And then we have a bumblebee on some baptisia, and another. This may be a type of resin bee. We have a red milkweed beetle, a eastern tiger swallowtail. We have a very interesting picture of a ladybug that looks somewhat sinister as it crawls its way out to get some aphids, and a and another jumping spider. There are so many kinds of jumping spiders here, and also crab spiders, but so many kinds of jumping spiders. It's pretty amazing. Next slide, please. Here we have another interesting cast of characters. We have a great crested flycatcher in the evergreen tree. We have a cardinal, a northern cardinal. They're year-round birds. We see them pretty much all the time, as well as the mourning doves, the blue jays, and the robins, and the house sparrows. We see a lot of those, of course. The gray catbird running along the edge of the boardwalk. That's usually a good spot to see catbirds because they like to run along and then peer over the edge and then run along a little bit more and peer over the edge. And then we have some fledgling starlings. The fledglings are just starting to get to be kind of a common occurrence here in June. And then some adult starlings. And here, interestingly, in the bottom middle, these are a pair of cedar waxwings that are doing a courtship ritual where they take this little, what appears to be a mulberry, and they pass it back and forth to each other repeatedly. And then a Baltimore Oriole. As you can see, there are a few of these pictures where they're in these dead trees or on dead limbs. It's another just one of those things that the birds seem to like them as perches. Next slide, please. All right, so as you can see, I don't know if you remember the spring picture where the boardwalk was incredibly visible. Now we have all this growth and all these flowers. Things are much taller. It's a lot harder to see the rabbit, although the rabbit is still there. And it's a lot more difficult to see those little ground birds and the little birds that hang out in the brush, like the yellow throats and things like that. But summer is an amazing time here. Goldfinches are coming out and flowers are just amazing. The woodland in this picture, the woodland sunflowers haven't quite taken off yet, but the milkweeds have. Out there in the meadow, you can see some of the taller, those are the American pokeweeds. Next slide, please. So here are some of our favorites. We have the woodland sunflower, which will be more in later July, and then the Joe Pye weed as well. We have more mountain mint. Yeah, mountain mint. And then, here's just a picture with, you can see the woodland sunflowers and the milkweeds and the cone flowers and the bee balm, which is these little purple one, like lavenderish plants down to the lower right. And then in the center lower is the anemone, which are pretty interesting to look at, honestly. Next slide. Here, it was difficult to choose which things to include and which things not to because there are just so many. So we have what appears to be a horse guard wasp, a longhorn bee on the woodland sunflower, a little cuckoo wasp, this little green and red one, cabbage white butterfly, which gardeners don't always like, or at least vegetable gardeners don't always like. Because they really like cabbage plants. And then we have, ladybugs. The grasshoppers are still pretty small. They're not adults yet. We have a common white-tailed dragonfly, a bilobe looper moth, a silver spotted skipper on the bee balm. Another dragonfly. They're common sights most of the summer. A spotted June beetle, and then monarchs it's usually pretty easy to see monarchs here. and they feed on many different flowers, not just the milkweeds. They just require the milkweeds for their younger life stages. They have to lay their eggs, and their caterpillars have to be on milkweed. Next slide, please. So July is a really good fledgling month. Most of these birds that you're looking at in these pictures are fledglings. There's the rabbit again. In the top left, this was a very interesting thing that I was seeing, was that the fledglings of multiple species seemed to be clustered together. In this photo, we have a house finch fledgling and a cedar waxwing fledgling, the one with its back to us, hanging out on the same branch. They seem to be together a lot. Not sure if that was if that was intentional on the parents' part or not, but the fledglings were all left in this little mulberry tree over here, and they mostly stayed there. There's a gray catbird on a nest that was actually hidden right in plain sight. Here. Oh, we have an eastern kingbird on the evergreen. We have a fledgling red-winged blackbird in the middle there on the pokeweed. We have a fledgling gray catbird and a fledgling robin that are both doing a behavior that you'll see here sometimes, where they'll get out in the sun on the boardwalk and they'll splay their wings out. What they're doing is they're using UV light to kill parasites. And then, of course, a red-bellied woodpecker and American goldfinch. Next slide, please. So more Joe Pyeweed and monarch. This one in the sort of in the middle, this yellow one is in the bottom is a American senna. The asters are starting to go. Here a bee pollinates the American pokeweed. We have brown-eyed Susans. The oaks are starting to produce acorns, and the asters are starting up. Next slide, please. Here we have some more amazing creatures. We have a red-banded hair-streaked butterfly, some wasps, and assassin bugs, cicada, which the kestrels start to show up and take the cicadas out of the trees. We have crab spiders and wasps, and this little leaf hopper that's disguised like a rose thorn. And then large milkweed bugs and all their progeny on the milkweed pod. Next slide, please. So we have a least flycatcher sitting on a pile of mugwort that one of the gardeners pulled out. We have the goldfinches, of course. They're a very common sight here in July and August, and even now. Mockingbirds, and we have American redstarts, and we have a blue-winged warbler, a yellow warbler, and a bat, and the monarchs are mating again. So that was really special. Next slide, please. And then September is a good time to see the asters and the goldenrods, as well as the purple top grass and the blazing star, which the butterflies absolutely love. Next slide. Blazing star with a monarch on it, of course. Orb weaver spider. That's a nocturnal orb weaver spider. We got some snails and more beetles and more butterflies, and every month is a slightly different cast. So there's also a nursery web spider there, and this is the locust borer longhorn beetle that we talked about, and the grasshoppers are much bigger now, right? All right, next slide. Here we have an eastern phoebe, a downy woodpecker, an orchard oriole, a red-eyed vireo, a blue-headed vireo, a black and white warbler peeking at us, northern parula, and a common yellowthroat, a female common yellowthroat. The yellowthroat, the vireo, black and white warbler, and the parula were all here today. So was the downy woodpecker. Next slide, please. All right, so here's fall. As you can see, things are starting to turn brown. The flowers are starting to become seed heads, and will be dropping their seeds. It's a good time for seed eating birds, and usually when the insect eating birds are starting to head out. Next slide, please. So we have a blue mist flower. We have a hermit thrush eating some cranberries. We have an ash-throated flycatcher there in the middle. That was a really special find. We have a wood aster and some milkweeds. Next slide. I wanted to highlight particularly these large milkweed bugs. In the later part of the year, they start to gather in these big piles on the boardwalk as they're preparing to go underground or, under the boards for winter. And it is very important to be mindful when in this space of where we walk, because with one careless step, as you can see, there are many, many insects in these piles, and one step can kill them all. So that's, that can be 75 to 100 lives gone in an instant. So this space really, it requires a little bit of awareness as you walk about it. Next slide, please. Here, there's a little golden crown kinglet and a ruby crown kinglet, and then this is a yellow-billed cuckoo bird that we found injured here, and unfortunately didn't make it. But it, as all things do when they die, they go back into the ground and feed the next generation. And then we have a northern flicker on the dead tree there, and a kestrel hanging out on top of the pole. Palm warblers, indigo bunting, scarlet tanager. Next slide, please. And then, of course, winter. This is, things are different. There's rain. It's a time when things are difficult for a lot of animals. A lot of animals go through a lot of hardship in the winter, and a lot of animals don't make it through the winter. Like the kinglets, supposedly up to 70% of their entire population dies over the winter. It's a very difficult life for them. Next slide, please. So I don't have a lot of pictures for winter because unfortunately I was dealing with my own deaths during the winter and I wasn't able to be here. But we had a little orange cat that visited. There's some more bunny poops, and we also, unfortunately, we had a Cooper's hawk die here, which we buried and allowed it to go back to the ground and feed again the next generation. Next slide, please. And just as a final thought, this was something that I actually read while I was working on this. And I paraphrased it a little bit, but as the bee collects nectar and departs without injuring the flower or its color or its scent, that's how we should live. So this is a space that really just, it requires a bit of understanding and a careful hand. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Great. I just want to thank everybody for joining. And, thank Eric and Brian for their time as well. And thank you for listening to us as we spoke about and shared this with you.